Picture this. You're a midwife, standing in the flickering shadows of a gilded bedchamber in Madrid, your hands trembling not from fatigue, but from dread. Heavy velvet curtains hang like funeral shrouds around the canopy bed, soaked in incense and sweat. Outside, the city slumbers beneath a low winter moon, but in the royal Alcazar, silence is shattered by the strained cries of a laboring queen and the murmured Latin of a priest pacing the marble floor. He clutches a vial of holy water, ready not to bless a triumph, but to sanctify a death. It is October 1661, and Queen Mariana of Austria is giving birth to the last hope of Spain's royal house. Her husband, Philip IV, the aging King of Spain, watches from a corner with eyes that betray more fear than joy. He is her uncle as well as her spouse, and as the child slips into the world, slick and limp and far too quiet, the air seems to thicken with something ancient and invisible. Not grace, not victory, but the heavy stink of consequence. They name him Carlos. From the moment of his arrival, Charles II is wrong. The attendants do not say it aloud. They cannot. But their hands move more gently than they should. Their eyes search one another for answers, and the silence that follows his first weak breath is deeper than any prayer. His limbs are thin, his skull misshapen, his eyelids heavy as if the world has already become too much to bear. He does not cry with force. He does not move with vigor. He lies still, his small chest rising and falling, as if in apology for the very act of surviving. To the court, he is a miracle. To those who have eyes to see, he is a warning. This is the heir to one of the most powerful empires on earth, a realm that once commanded the seas and swallowed continents whole. Spain, rich with the silver of the New World, draped in Catholic tradition, feared from Flanders to Manila. Yet here, in the heart of its royal palace, the bloodline that fueled centuries of conquest has curdled into something fragile, broken, and doomed. For generations, the Habsburgs have married their own, cousins, uncles, nieces. The family tree has grown into a circle, twisting back upon itself like a serpent eating its own tail. It was done in the name of purity, of alliance, of dynastic pride. But every secret wedding, every papal dispensation for consanguinity, every whispered promise of a stronger throne has carried a price. And now that price lies swaddled in silk, a newborn who cannot suckle, who cannot focus his eyes, who must be baptized within hours, not out of celebration, but out of fear he may not live until morning. Mariana weeps, not tears of joy, not yet, perhaps not ever. She has fulfilled her duty. She has delivered a son. But she sees the child's sunken jaw, the tongue too large for his mouth, the vacant stare. She knows. And though she will become his fiercest protector, though she will wield his crown like a sword for decades, she understands, on some level deeper than reason, that this child is no savior. He is the end of a story written in blood and pride. The priests bless him. The physicians remain silent, and the court whispers. They do not expect him to live, but he does. He lingers. And with every passing day, what began as concern hardens into grim understanding. Charles cannot feed without choking. His limbs do not respond properly to touch. His eyes cross and drift. His skin remains pallid and loose. He does not respond to music, to laughter, to the sound of his father's voice. It is as if he lives behind a wall of glass, unable or unwilling to step into the world the rest of them inhabit. Still, the court demands portraits. Artists are summoned to capture the air, but always with instruction. Soften the features, correct the jaw, brighten the gaze. Paint not the child who struggles to breathe, but the future monarch who will restore Spain to glory. The image must be strong, because the reality cannot be. And yet, behind the canvas and gold, the palace becomes a mausoleum of hope. Philip IV is no stranger to disappointment. He has lost children before, 10 of them to early death or disease. His eldest son, by another marriage, died just 3 years prior. Charles is all that remains, and he clings to that fact with the desperation of a man standing on a crumbling cliff, hoping the sea will forget to swallow him. But the king is aging, his once magnificent beard now streaked with white, his once firm voice slurred by time and defeat. His ministers see the child and know what it means. Spain cannot survive another century of Habsburg inbreeding, not with France rising, not with the treasury emptying, not with the colonies seething beneath the weight of greed. And yet no one dares say it. Instead, they surround Charles with luxury, embroidered gowns, lace pillows, painted cribs. They speak to him in Latin, Castilian, and whispers of prayer. They parade him before nobles who nod and smile and feel something sharp twist in their guts as the boy drools on royal linens and stares into the middle distance. There is no laughter in the nursery, only silence and ritual and dread. As Charles grows older, the signs become impossible to ignore. He cannot stand. He cannot walk. His spine curves unnaturally, his head too heavy for his neck. His tongue spills from his mouth like a secret too terrible to swallow. He does not speak, not because he lacks language, but because his body will not allow him to shape it. When he does make noise, it is a groan, a whimper, a low animal sound that sends shivers down the backs of his attendants. And still, he is crowned prince. Still, he is announced as heir to the empire. Because to do otherwise would be to admit that the Habsburg blood has failed, that the centuries of inbreeding, cloaked in righteousness and power, have finally borne fruit, and that fruit is rotting on the branch before the world's eyes. They say the sins of the father shall be visited upon the son. But Charles is no sinner. He is the consequence, the living embodiment of every secret compromise made in the halls of power. As the boy approaches 5 years old, a slow horror dawns across the court. He may live long enough to rule. And what then? He cannot ride. He cannot lead an army. He cannot speak to his people. He cannot produce an heir. He cannot hold a pen or read a treaty. His bones are brittle, his joints inflamed, his mind unreachable. He is a king in name only, and even that is a fiction stitched from desperation. Still, they dress him in velvet. Still, they parade him on feast days. Still, they whisper prayers for strength and miracles while hiding their despair behind embroidered fans and political theatre. But no miracle comes. Instead, the sun sets on Spain a little earlier each year, and in the golden cradle of the Alcazar, a child of royal blood lays mute beneath the weight of 1,000 years of arrogance, bearing the crown not as honor, but as curse. The empire has not yet fallen, but it has already begun to rot from the inside. And Charles, sickly, silent, broken, is the corpse that must pretend to rule. There were whispers long before Charles was born, whispers that curled through the candlelit courts of Europe, that passed between midwives and priests, between marriage brokers and physicians, whispered in Latin and Castilian, in Italian and German, and always behind closed doors. The Habsburgs are folding in on themselves. And yet, the weddings continued. The family that ruled from Madrid to Vienna, from Naples to the New World, believed itself chosen, ordained by God, preserved by divine right and blood. But the blood that pulsed through their veins was not clean. It was thick with repetition, with echoes, with memory chasing memory, like a mirror reflected in a mirror until the image dissolves into blur. For over 2 centuries, the Habsburg dynasty had practiced a marriage custom so singular, so insular, that it turned alliance into affliction. They married each other, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, again and again and again. They did it for power, for purity, for the preservation of land and title. They feared dilution more than they feared disease. They feared foreign blood more than death itself. The result was not a tree, but a circle, roots devouring roots, branches strangling one another until nothing new could grow. By the time Charles II entered the world, his lineage was less a family and more a closed system collapsing in on itself. His father, Philip IV, had married his niece, Mariana of Austria. Their shared blood came from both sides, paternal and maternal, looping endlessly back to a handful of ancestors repeated again and again, like a chant no one dared interrupt. Of the 16 great-grandparents a human being is meant to have, Charles had only 9. His pedigree, when traced, revealed a horrifying latticework of incestuous unions and repeated genes. The same names echoed. Joanna of Castile, Juana la Loca, the Mad Queen, appeared multiple times. Her madness passed like a torch, invisible but burning. Emperor Charles V, who fought to rule a world on which the sun never set, was both great-great-grandfather and great-uncle. The blood was royal, but it was broken, and the price was written on Charles's face. The jaw was impossible to ignore. That grotesque, jutting mandible, the infamous Habsburg jaw, had been growing more pronounced for generations, but Charles's was monstrous. His teeth could not meet. He could barely chew. His tongue, oversized and clumsy, spilled constantly from between cracked lips. He drooled when he spoke. He drooled when he slept. But that was just the surface. Inside, the inheritance was even worse. His skeleton had not formed properly. His limbs were short, underdeveloped, their joints so loose they dislocated under the strain of standing. His spine was crooked, his torso malformed. His digestive system worked only intermittently, his stomach constantly bloated with air, incapable of properly processing food. He was frequently bedridden with fever and diarrhea. His body ran too cold. His skin was thin, nearly translucent in places, laced with veins that throbbed visibly beneath the surface. And his mind was a clouded thing. A palace with the doors closed, the windows shuttered, and no light inside. He was prone to seizures, outbursts, tremors. His attention wandered like smoke. He forgot faces, lost track of conversations, misread the tone of a room, laughed when he should cry, cried when he should be still. He struggled to speak, and when he did, his words came in slurred, staccato bursts, barely intelligible, half swallowed by the weight of his own tongue. His tutors despaired, his doctors prayed, his family denied, because to admit the truth would mean more than just shame. It would mean reckoning with centuries of choices. It would mean admitting that power, when left to feed on itself, becomes poison, so they cloaked it in ceremony. They declared him delicate, not disabled, sensitive, not slow, holy, not hollow, and they blamed anything but blood. Some whispered of curses, of witches, of hidden enemies who had bewitched the child in the womb. Others pointed fingers at the Moorish past, at ancient heresies, at demons clawing their way through the royal line. Anything to avoid the obvious, that no body, no soul, could emerge whole from a lineage so devoured by itself. Physicians dissected the family line in secret. Behind closed doors, they traced the loops and overlaps, the doubled ancestors, the stillbirths, the madnesses, the ones who died young, the ones who never spoke. And again, they found patterns of cleft palates and club feet, of drooping eyes and still minds. The Habsburgs were not cursed. They were constructed this way, on purpose, with full knowledge, with intention. And Charles was the end of that design, the final product of a blueprint that had ignored nature's warnings for too long. He was not a mistake. He was the inevitable result of a system that believed it could bend biology to its will, that it could defy the body in the name of legacy. The court spoke of him as unfortunate. But he was not just unfortunate. He was sacrificed, offered on the altar of ambition by men and women who believed their names outweighed their children's lives. His suffering was not an accident. It was a cost calculated and paid for by generations who had chosen pride over mercy, inheritance over humanity. Charles did not know this. He could not have, but his body remembered. Every day he woke into pain. Every step, every attempt at speech, every attempt at control over his own limbs reminded him, wordlessly, endlessly, that he was not like other boys, that he would never be. And all around him, the empire rotted. The treasury was emptying. The wars were unwinnable. The colonies whispered rebellion. And yet, the court danced. They powdered his face, dressed him in brocade, placed a crown upon his malformed head, and called him Majesty. They wrote his decrees for him. They moved his hand when it came time to sign. They arranged marriages he did not understand, and praised him for alliances he could not comprehend. Because to do otherwise would be to look at him and see themselves, to see what centuries of fear and selfishness had wrought, to see that they had not built a dynasty, they had built a tomb, and inside that tomb, wrapped in silks and ceremony, Charles sat, breathing, drooling, smiling faintly at a world that had never wanted him whole. A child born with too much blood and not enough future, and still the lineage was celebrated. Still they clung to the name Habsburg, like it could save them from the very death it carried in its veins. Still they insisted that Charles was king, not just in title, but in divine right. Still they dressed him in the bones of empires and called it destiny. But history has no mercy, and blood, no matter how royal, cannot escape itself. By his 3rd birthday, the royal nursery had become a shrine of dread. The women who once cooed over his tiny fingers and whispered prayers at his crib now moved through the room like mourners. The air was heavy with lavender and rosewater, meant to mask the sour rot of illness and the faint metallic tang of dried blood from yet another nosebleed. The palace had commissioned new toys, new tutors, new nurses. But Charles remained motionless in his velvet cradle, blinking slowly, his fingers twisting the embroidered hem of his sleeve like a child lost in a world no one else could see. He did not speak, not words at least. He moaned sometimes or whimpered, grunted when touched. But language, true language, was a country beyond the reach of his mind and body. Doctors came and went, muttering in hushed tones about delayed development, about the sanctity of patience, about divine tests. But none could hide the truth. Charles was a child who did not respond. He did not ask for toys. He did not recognize his name. He did not smile at his mother unless prompted. And still, they called him Majestad. It wasn't until he was nearly 4 years old that he began to make sounds that vaguely resembled speech, half syllables, dragged through drool, muffled by the sheer size of his tongue. It filled his mouth like a sponge, swollen and thick, pressing against his teeth, turning every attempt at a word into something grotesque and barely intelligible. It flopped out between his lips when he tried to eat, when he tried to breathe, when he tried to smile, and he drooled, constantly. His chin was raw with irritation, red and flaking, a source of endless discomfort that no physician could cure and no cloth could keep dry. Servants had to change his linens multiple times a day, always in silence, always pretending that nothing was wrong. When guests visited, he was kept in a special chair, propped upright, his head supported by pillows disguised as royal finery. They called him sweet. They called him angelic. They spoke to him as if he understood, as if he was not staring into space while thick strings of saliva glistened in the firelight. He did not walk. His legs were too soft. his knees prone to dislocation. When he attempted to crawl, he moved like a marionette, missing half its strings, jerking forward, collapsing, gasping. It was not until he was nearly 8 years old that he could stand for longer than a minute. Even then, walking was not a triumph. It was a spectacle. His body did not obey him. His gait was uneven, pitiful. Each step a tremble. Each movement requiring the careful coordination of attendants who hovered beside him like shadows, ready to catch him at any moment. He fell often, and when he did, the palace paused, not in sympathy, in fear, because each fall might be the one that broke him. He suffered seizures, violent, rolling attacks that twisted his limbs and left his mouth foaming. Some lasted minutes, others hours. They came without warning, and their aftermath was always the same. Days of silence, of fever, of shivering under blankets that could not stop the cold from clawing its way up his spine. His immune system was feeble. He caught everything. A cough in the court became pneumonia in the prince. A scratch became an infection. A fever became a funeral vigil. His bones grew slowly, unevenly, almost resentfully. His ribs jutted like shipwrecked timber beneath his skin. His spine curved at the base, pulling his posture forward into a permanent hunch. His chest caved slightly on one side. He wheezed when he laughed, which was rare and never at the right time. And yet, he lived. Somehow, impossibly, against the silent prayers of ministers and the whispered doubts of nobles, Charles continued to survive. The empire's priests called it a sign, a miracle, proof that God favored the Spanish crown, that no matter how sickly the flesh, divine right was immune to nature. The court clung to that narrative, because the alternative was too shameful to bear. So they lied. They commissioned portraits, dozens of them, great oil-brush triumphs of illusion. Charles standing tall in a red cloak, his eyes alert, his posture regal, his jaw softened, his lips closed to hide the drool. He was always depicted with horses, swords, or globes, symbols of rule, of might, of control. But the real child behind the canvas was none of those things. When the painter was not present, he slumped in chairs designed to hold his weight like scaffolding. He was lifted into position for formal events. His robes were sewn with hidden ties to keep his limbs from flailing. When he needed to speak, a trusted servant whispered the phrase first, slowly, encouraging him to repeat it, syllable by broken syllable. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes he simply stared. Mariana, his mother, doted on him. Fiercely. She believed him special, not cursed. She refused to hear criticism, refused to acknowledge the reality of his decline. She demanded the court treat him with reverence, insisted that ministers kneel before him even when he was too weak to raise his head in response. She bathed him herself at times, sang to him at night like he was still an infant. She believed love could cure what blood had done, but even she could not deny what was happening. Charles would never be normal. He would never ride a horse alone. He would never address a crowd without assistance. He would never father a child. He had the body of a king, perhaps, the bloodline, the crown, but his body would not grow. His mind would not sharpen. His voice would not rise above a whisper. He was alive, but not becoming. And as the years passed, that truth became a weight, not just on the boy, but on the entire nation. Ministers avoided placing papers in his hands. Courtiers began crafting excuses to avoid being alone with him, frightened not of cruelty, but of discomfort, of witnessing a monarch who could not rule, a child who could not lead, a symbol of power who embodied only decay. They dressed him in pearls and velvet. They hosted balls in his honor. But the candles in the chandeliers flickered more with dread than celebration. Spain was aging, its coffers emptying, its armies retreating. its colonies restless. And at the center of it all sat a boy in a golden chair, drooling, twitching, unable to hold a spoon. And yet, the portraits endured, because to show him as he truly was would mean showing the world what Spain had become. Not glorious, not holy, not eternal, but withered, trembling, and no longer able to feed itself without choking. There were days when he sat for hours by the window, unmoving, staring not at the city below or the clouds above, but into some invisible middle distance. His mouth hung slightly open, the corners pulled by the weight of a jaw too large and a mind too far away. His attendants said he was thinking. His mother said he was meditating. But those who were braver, those who watched closely, knew better. He was lost. Charles, King of Spain, sovereign of an empire that stretched across oceans and continents, could not follow a simple conversation. He could not hold a thought longer than a few moments. His responses were delayed, slurred, often unrelated to the question. He blinked slowly, sometimes smiled when there was no reason, and frequently laughed at things no one else could hear. It wasn't madness, not exactly. It was something deeper, something quieter. A fog wrapped in flesh, a crown balanced atop a cage. The word they used was imbecile, a term that, in the 17th century, carried no soft edges. It meant broken, stunted, incapable. He was surrounded by tutors, scholars, clerics, each assigned to teach him something, anything: Latin, history, theology, law. Day after day, they attempted to lead him through the labyrinth of illiteracy, and day after day they emerged empty-handed. He could recite prayers sometimes. He could sign his name shakily, with assistance. But he could not read a decree. He could not write a sentence without months of repetition, tracing the same shapes over and over until the ink blurred and the page turned to holes. They praised him for memorization when, in truth, he was repeating things he did not understand. When asked to explain what he had said, he would look away or stammer nonsense. He could not grasp nuance, could not process contradiction. A royal edict and a child's riddle held equal weight in his mind, both equally mysterious, both equally out of reach. They taught him etiquette, phrases to use in court, smiles to mimic, words to repeat when diplomats bowed before him. But the act of speech itself remained an ordeal. His oversized tongue tripped over consonants, softened vowels, strangled meaning in his throat. Most of what came out of his mouth had to be interpreted by someone who had worked with him for years. Servants who knew the patterns of his limitations, the cadences of his confusion. And even then, they often got it wrong. He was surrounded by people, always, never left alone. And yet he was one of the loneliest figures to ever wear a crown. The courtiers debated behind closed doors, not whether he should rule, because he already was king, but whether he could even understand that he was king, whether he knew what Spain was, what it meant to govern, whether he could grasp war or famine or treaty, whether his nods of approval were signs of consent or simply habit, learned responses to voices and glances and hands guiding his chin. Some believed he was aware, trapped inside a broken vessel, screaming silently through the gaps in his intellect. Others believed there was nothing inside, that the boy who had failed to grow was now a man who had never begun. And yet, he listened. Always. He watched their mouths when they spoke. He followed them with his eyes, his head tilting slightly as if trying to understand a language he'd never been taught. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when something sharp would flicker behind his expression. A shadow of thought, a trace of fear, a flash of sadness that would disappear before it could be named. In those moments, it was unbearable to look at him. Because what if he did understand? What if he knew on some level that he was failing, that everyone around him smiled too often, that they spoke too slowly, that they never asked his opinion, only fed him scripts and waited for nods. What if he knew the throne beneath him was not a gift, but a prison? That his robes were not garments, but disguises? That every celebration in his honor was really a ritual of grief? He was present for council meetings, of course, required to sit and observe as men debated war, famine, foreign threat. He would be guided into the chamber, lowered gently into a carved wooden chair, and left to sit while ministers circled him like planets around a dying star. Sometimes they read documents aloud, sometimes they presented petitions, sometimes they addressed him directly. He would blink, smile, grunt, nod. They recorded his approval. They called it royal assent, but everyone knew the decisions were made elsewhere. By the Queen Mother, by the Council of Castile, by trusted advisors who had long stopped pretending that Charles could rule. They did not ask what he thought. They asked what they should tell him to think. Even foreign envoys pitied him. They wrote home in coded language, careful not to offend the crown, but their letters revealed the truth. And yet Charles persisted. He did not protest, did not rebel, did not collapse into madness or silence. He smiled, nodded, wept when told to, kissed the hand of his mother, signed where they told him. Whether out of confusion or trust or simply a deep, inexpressible desire to be loved, he complied. It is a particular kind of tragedy to live without the ability to shape one's life, to exist in a world where every decision, every word, every expression is borrowed, where your face is painted onto coins and banners, but your voice is never truly heard, where your thoughts are doubted, your intentions guessed, your presence tolerated more than desired. That was Charles's life. He was a king with no kingdom in his grasp, a man with no mastery over his mind, a ruler whose every word was filtered, whose every act was managed, whose entire existence was a theatre of shadow and silence. And still, they dressed him in the garments of power. Still, they prayed for his reign and bowed before his chair and whispered behind their fans when he passed. They feared what would happen when he died, but some feared more what would happen if he lived too long, because the longer he sat upon the throne, the clearer it became that Spain, once the empire on which the sun never set, was now ruled by a man who could not even speak clearly enough to call for help. The throne was golden, but the hands that held it were not his. They dressed him in velvet and brocade, in garments stitched by the finest hands in Castile, but he never chose the colour. They placed the crown gently upon his head, though he could not lift it himself. They guided his fingers to ink-stained parchment and whispered where to sign, but the words, treaties, proclamations, decrees, meant nothing to him. They were air, movement, theatre. Charles sat and blinked and nodded, and Spain ruled itself, or rather, it tried. The real weight of the Spanish Empire, fractured and bloated and teetering on the edge of ruin, was carried by others. By Queen Mariana, his mother, fierce and devout, a woman raised in the echoing halls of Austrian piety and Spanish discipline, by advisors and confessors, by generals and courtiers who jockeyed for power behind silk partitions and beneath oil-painted ceilings. The boy king was present in form, but absent in function, a fragile icon of a dying age. Mariana ruled in his name, with hands clasped in prayer and eyes sharp as razors. She clung to her son with a desperation that bordered on mania, shielding him from scandal, from insult, from reality itself. She negotiated with nobles, silenced dissenters, bribed bishops, and dismissed ministers who failed to play the part she required. She was mother, queen, regent, and prison warden all in one. She would not allow the world to see what Charles had become, what he had always been. In private, She wept over his fevers and seizures. In public, she declared him blessed, chosen, sanctified by suffering. Every weakness was recast as divine endurance, every blunder as proof of purity. And if anyone suggested otherwise, if a general or an ambassador or a scholar dared imply that the king was not fit to rule, they were exiled, dismissed, sometimes even arrested under charges of treason. But truth has a way of leaking through cracks in the marble. The empire was unraveling. Spain, once the iron fist of Europe, had become a limp hand, shaking from exhaustion. The treasury, long swollen with silver from the Americas, had been plundered by centuries of war and corruption. The mines in Potosi were drying up. Galleons sank beneath the weight of debt, and merchants turned away from Spanish ports. Inflation choked the cities. Hunger crept through the countryside like a slow plague. The army, once feared across the continent, had become a ghost of its former self, underpaid, underfed, scattered. Foreign powers encroached upon Spanish holdings. France, under the Sun King, laughed behind gilded fans while carving pieces off the Spanish border. The Dutch broke treaties with impunity. England watched the decline with cold detachment, waiting for the final collapse. And all the while, Charles sat, blinking, smiling, drooling into silk. He was not oblivious, not completely. There were moments, brief, heartbreaking moments, when his eyes darkened, when he asked why people whispered around him, why his orders were not obeyed unless his mother repeated them. But the answers never came. His days were filled with pageantry and prayer, with rituals that insulated rather than informed. He heard mass, he attended court, he kissed relics, he stared at maps he could not read. And around him, a country bled. Nobles fought not for Spain, but for control of Charles. Whoever held his ear, such as it was, held the reins of the entire empire. Factions formed like bruises across the court, pro-French, pro-Austrian, pro-papacy, anti-Mariana, anti-reform. Each whisper in the corridor, each letter passed beneath doors, was a bid for the soul of a king who could barely form a sentence. He was passed from minister to minister, each leaving a trail of chaos in his wake. Some tried to reform the economy, others tried to prepare for war. Most simply stole what they could, padded their estates, and vanished before the rot could stain their names. Spain became a house infested with termites, grand in structure, hollow at the core. And Charles? He was the wallpaper. He was shown off at weddings and christenings, dressed in gold and crimson, a smile painted painfully across his face. Foreign dignitaries bowed before him, and then laughed in their carriages on the way home. Painters continued to capture him in oils, always more handsome than he truly was, always more upright, more alert, more kingly. But in private, he was reduced to an infant. Servants fed him by hand. Attendants wiped his mouth. His bedding was checked for accidents. He could not tie his shoes. He could not read a prayer book without someone guiding his finger along the lines. When he tried to speak for himself, the court grew silent, terrified not of his words, but of the fact that they might be unintelligible. And yet his reign continued. Because it had to. Because to admit the truth, to declare Charles unfit, would be to tear the veil from centuries of divine monarchy. It would be to confess that the bloodline had failed, that the gods did not protect kings, that heredity could produce not strength, but frailty, that God had not chosen Charles, but perhaps forsaken him. And so the charade endured. Year after year, the ministers rotated, the territories shrank, the churches grew louder, the peasants grew hungrier, and Charles remained, a living relic of a time that could not continue, and yet refused to end. He was not a ruler, he was a warning, a trembling child crowned in desperation, used not to lead, but to hide the fact that there was nothing left to lead. His presence on the throne was not a testament to dynasty. It was the final act in a tragedy that had begun long before his birth, when the Habsburgs first decided that blood mattered more than breath, that legacy mattered more than life. Spain had once ruled the world. Now, it propped up a boy who could not speak and called it sovereignty. And in the silence of the throne room, beneath the rustle of robes and the murmur of forced reverence, one could almost hear the empire dying, not with a scream, but with a sigh too soft to be noticed, until it was far too late. They began to whisper it in the back pews of churches, in the shadows of palace kitchens, in the mouths of barefoot pilgrims and silk-robed nobles alike. He is bewitched. El Hechizado. The name moved through Spain like smoke, curling into ears, into prayers, into the private journals of clergymen and the bawdy songs of taverns. It clung to the boy king like incense in his hair, a name not born of mockery, but of terrified reverence, as if to name the curse was to protect oneself from it. Because surely, no child born of Catholic monarchs, no ruler anointed by God himself, could suffer so hideously unless something unholy had taken hold. The human mind, especially in suffering, hungers for meaning. And when medicine failed, and when bloodlines refused to explain what should never have been born, the people turned to what they could understand: witches, demons, hexes, the invisible hands of malevolent forces working their poison in the very veins of Christendom's mightiest monarch. It made sense in a world still ruled by relics and rosaries, where plagues were penance and storms were judgment. The son of Philip IV was not just disabled, he was haunted. He trembled without cause. He moaned in his sleep. He muttered nonsense, sometimes in strange voices, sometimes in Latin he had never been taught. When the wind howled through the palace and Charles whimpered in fear, even the servants crossed themselves. They said his tongue was too large, not because of inbreeding, but because it had once been forked, the demon's mark reshaped by divine hands. They said he could not produce an heir because witches had sealed his loins with black wax, buried his seed in grave dirt. They said that when he spoke, it was not always him speaking. And Mariana, devout as she was cunning, did not dismiss these rumors. She invited them. Because if Charles was bewitched, he was not broken by birth. He was attacked. He was innocent. He was a victim of heresy, not heredity. And if his suffering was the work of evil, then his perseverance was the work of God. So she ordered exorcisms, not in secret, but as ceremony. Dominican priests were summoned to the palace. Crosses were carried through the halls. Holy water was sprinkled on pillows and thrones, on the boy himself as he trembled in his heavy robes. Candles were lit at every doorway. Psalms were chanted for hours. Incense burned so thick it stung the eyes of everyone present. And Charles, pale, sweating, his lips twitching, was made to sit through it all. He did not protest. He did not cry. He simply stared, blinking slowly as men in black and white screamed prayers in his face, commanded demons to reveal themselves, held crucifixes before his chest until he flinched, not from evil, but from confusion, from the raw terror of not understanding why those meant to protect him now looked at him as if he were a thing to be driven out. One priest claimed Charles growled during the rite. Another swore the king's voice changed midway through a prayer, that it deepened, hissed, and cursed in a language unknown to them. These accounts spread like fire. Letters were sent to Rome. Reports were written for the Inquisition. Paintings were commissioned depicting Charles in saintly poses, eyes cast heavenward, surrounded by angels as shadows fled his body. But nothing changed. His tongue remained swollen. His limbs remained weak. His mind remained fogged. So they tried again. another exorcism, then another, always with more urgency, more fervor, as if faith could force the truth to bend. In one particularly brutal ritual, Charles was made to fast for days. He vomited bile. He passed out from exhaustion. The priest declared it a victory, proof that the demon had been weakened. But when the king awoke, he had bitten through his lip in the seizure, and his sheets were soaked in blood. Even as Charles grew into his 20s, the rituals did not stop. The court brought in mystics, herbalists, exorcists from distant provinces. One woman, an alleged holy visionary from Toledo, claimed to have seen the curse in a dream. A black snake coiled around Charles's spine, hissing names of the dead into his ears. She said the only cure was to burn his hair and bury the ashes beneath the altar of a ruined church. The hair was burned. The curse remained, but the people believed. Because the alternative, that a child could be born this way from nothing but royal blood, that the power they had worshipped for centuries could produce this suffering, was too dangerous, too humiliating, too mortal. And so Charles became a vessel not just of pity, but of sacred narrative. His pain was Christ-like, his stunted body a symbol of religious endurance. The king, cursed but surviving, drooling but crowned, became not just monarch, but martyr. A new Job, a living relic of God's inscrutable will. The Jesuits wrote prayers for his healing. Pilgrimages were made in his name. Holy men touched his garments, hoping for sanctified residue. And Charles sat through it all, eyes dull, lips wet, hands shaking as incense choked the air around him. Did he know? Did he understand what they were saying? That he was possessed? That he was the battlefield between heaven and hell? Did he know that his inability to father a child had been twisted into evidence of demonic interference? Or did he simply feel the growing weight of eyes, always watching, always judging, always hoping that the next seizure, the next outburst, would be the one that revealed the beast inside? They said he was cursed, but the truth was worse. He was not a battlefield. He was the ruin left behind, not torn apart by devils, but by centuries of arrogance dressed in gold and prayers. And in the echo of the chants, in the furious Latin of men trying to scream away the consequences of their own design, Charles sat, silent, twitching, mouth agape, still waiting for a salvation that would never come. The wedding bells rang loud, but the bedchamber was quiet. When Charles was first married, at the age of 18, there was hope, or at least the fragile illusion of it. The bride was young, French, luminous, the niece of Louis XIV, Marie-Louise of Orléans. She arrived at the Spanish court with eyes full of fear and gowns heavy with gold thread. A girl caught between thrones, sent not to find love, but to fix a dynasty. She was barely 16. Charles, already bent with illness, stood at her side like a shadow sculpted in wax, fragile, solemn, and nearly mute. The ceremony was lavish. Spain needed it to be. Priests blessed the union with trembling hands. Courtiers clapped too loudly, laughed too long, drank too much. There was a desperation beneath the celebration, because this wedding was not about joy. It was about survival, about hope, about continuation. All of Spain prayed for a child. They whispered it into rosaries, knelt for it in churches, lit candles until the altars wept wax. A prince, a daughter, anything. A seed to plant in the failing soil of empire. But the sheets remained cold. Charles, still unable to properly speak, could not court his wife in any meaningful sense. He could not express desire, could barely initiate conversation. His tongue, his jaw, his mind. None of them knew how to ask or how to act. He drooled in her presence. He laughed at strange moments. He cried sometimes without warning. He needed help undressing, help eating, help bathing. He was not a husband, he was a boy, confused, sick, and utterly dependent. Marie-Louise did what she could. She played the part. She walked beside him in processions, smiled when he reached for her hand, sat in silence while he muttered incoherently beside her. In private, she was said to weep. Her letters, though censored, hint at despair. She was pitied by some, mocked by others, but she endured. The pressure to produce an heir intensified with every passing month. Charles's advisors arranged appointments with physicians, holy men, and mystics. They brewed tonics of bull's blood, crushed pearls, and wine. They sent him to bed with blessing oils rubbed into his thighs. One ritual involved placing Charles's feet into a basin of melted wax while monks prayed for virility. Nothing worked. Behind closed doors, the rumors sharpened that Charles was impotent, that he was not a man at all, that his wife lay beside him in stiff silence, untouched, as he whispered to saints instead of reaching for her, that he wept after failed attempts, clutching his stomach in shame. The court grew tense. Every cough from Marie-Louise, every change in appetite, sparked gossip. And every month her body remained unchanged. The silence grew louder. When she died at just 26, suddenly, mysteriously, there were whispers of poison. Some believed the Queen Mother had grown tired of waiting for a child and cleared the path for a new bride. Others believed Marie-Louise had simply faded, withered from the inside out by years of despair, of pretending, of lying next to a man who would never be more than a boy in a crown. Charles mourned her, fiercely, in his way. He locked himself in his chambers. He sobbed. He refused to eat. His already fragile health dipped further into darkness. Whether he grieved the woman or the symbol of what she was meant to give him, no one could say. But the court wasted no time. A new wife was chosen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, German, strong-willed, fertile by reputation. One of 17 children, proof, they said, of good blood, good hips, God's favour. The second marriage was colder. Maria Anna, older than her predecessor, saw at once what Charles was. She referred to him as a child, treated him as such, fed him with her own hands, dressed him when his attendants were dismissed. She was less a queen than a caretaker, less a bride than a nursemaid. Still, she played her role. She entered his bedchamber. She bore the weight of Spain's expectations like a chain around her neck. When no child came, she lied, claimed to feel fluttering in her belly. Doctors were called. No heartbeat was found. So the rituals began again. More prayers, more potions, more humiliations cloaked in sanctity. Charles was made to sleep with relics tied to his thighs, to bathe in water drawn from sacred springs, to eat fruit of virility blessed by the Pope's own emissaries. His body, already broken, was pushed further, forced to endure the weight of hope, of legacy, of centuries of incest and expectation condensed into one sickly man's groin. But there was no heir, there would be no heir, and the empire knew. The Habsburg succession had reached its final thread, and it was unraveling. Ministers scrambled to position themselves. Foreign powers began to whisper about partition. Louis XIV circled like a vulture. The Holy Roman Emperor drew lines on maps. And within the palace, the Queen locked her doors at night and prayed not for a child, but for an end to this grotesque theatre. Charles grew more erratic. He developed facial tics. He screamed in the night. His teeth rotted. He could not sleep without aides watching to ensure he did not choke on his tongue. His body, hollowed out by time and blood and grief, had become little more than a throne-shaped coffin. Still, the marriage endured, because it had to. To end it would be to admit defeat, to dissolve the final illusion that Spain had a future. And so they continued the charade. They walked through the gardens, sat side by side in mass, appeared together on balconies while the people below cheered, not for love, but for lineage. But the cheers were thinner now, the crowds smaller, the hope gone. And inside the palace, a queen who had never been a wife cared for a husband who had never been a man. Both of them imprisoned by history, by expectation, by a name that once ruled the world and now could not produce even a single child. This was not just infertility, it was extinction, and the silence between them, in that grand royal bed, was not simply a failure of flesh. It was the echo of an empire realizing that its bloodline had finally bled itself dry. The palace walls were still hung with gold, but the cracks had already begun to spread. You could feel it in the marble beneath your feet, hear it in the strained chords of the court musicians, smell it in the dust collecting at the corners of forgotten wings. Spain, the once mighty, once invincible empire, was dying, and it was not a sudden death, but a long, agonizing unraveling stretched across the length of Charles's reign like a wound that would not close. He had come to power when Spain was already bleeding, but under his rule, the bleeding turned septic. The silver that had once poured in from the Americas, great rivers of wealth that fed the empire's wars, palaces, and arrogance, was drying to a trickle. The mines of Potosi, overworked and drained, yielded less with each passing year. Galleons once loaded with gold now returned light or not at all, picked off by Dutch pirates or sunk by storms that seemed, even to the faithful, like divine judgment. The treasury emptied itself in waves, first to fund campaigns against France, then to put down uprisings in Naples, Sicily, and Catalonia. Charles, too feeble to understand the full scope of war, signed off on taxes that starved villages, raised levies that bled the countryside dry. Noble families fled to their estates, hoarding what they could. Farmers burned their crops, rather than hand them over to collectors. Entire provinces slid toward rebellion, whispering in the dark about independence, about revolution, about breaking the chain before it choked them all. And through it all, Charles sat, face pale, eyes sunken, his hands shaking so violently they had to be tied beneath the folds of his robe during public appearances. The armies that Spain once sent thundering across Europe were now reduced to scraps, mercenaries unpaid, local militias ill-equipped, generals corrupt or inept. Battles that would have once been victories ended in retreat or humiliation. In Flanders, in Italy, in the Pyrenees, Spanish flags were trampled into the mud by French boots. And always, the court in Madrid claimed otherwise, rewriting defeat into valor, dressing disaster in the language of martyrdom. But the people knew. They knew when bread prices doubled, when sons never returned from campaigns that bore no fruit, when widows outnumbered brides and famine took the youngest first. Spain was a colossus built on sand, and every tremor beneath Charles's throne loosened more of its foundation. In the Americas, the myth of control frayed further. Viceroys fought among themselves. Local elites resisted the crown's decrees. Indigenous uprisings grew bolder, fueled not just by anger, but by the knowledge that Madrid was far and growing weaker. Trade routes were no longer safe. Ports became battlegrounds. Corruption spread like mold through the halls of colonial administration, and royal oversight thinned into whispers. Even the clergy, once the iron backbone of Spanish unity, began to doubt. Monasteries fell into disrepair. Bishops wrote letters to Rome that were more desperate than devout, and in quiet confessions, behind veils and stone, men and women asked their priests whether God had turned away from Spain altogether. And still, Charles remained, sick, silent, unmarried in spirit, childless in fact. He was the face of a kingdom, and that face had aged into something hollow. His eyes no longer focused, his teeth blackened. He could not digest food properly. He vomited after nearly every meal. His hair fell out in clumps, his legs swelled with water. His speech, always difficult, now came only in mumbles, when it came at all. Sometimes he mistook courtiers for ghosts. Sometimes he forgot who he was. And yet no one could speak of succession, not openly. To question the future was to challenge the crown. To plan for it was to admit that the king was mortal. But the silence grew heavy, and the world watched. Foreign courts, already divided into factions of ambition, prepared for the moment Charles would die. France positioned its candidate, Philip of Anjou, grandson of the Sun King. Austria offered Archduke Charles of the Austrian Habsburg line. England, the Dutch Republic. Even the Pope began to calculate, because Spain, for all its weakness, still held the largest empire in the world. Whoever inherited its crown would inherit its lands, its armies, its debts, its decaying magnificence. It was not just a matter of inheritance, it was a matter of balance, of power, of war. And Charles, who could barely keep his eyes open through a council meeting, who now needed help to dress, to stand, to relieve himself, held the keys to that future in his trembling, translucent hands. His court fractured along lines of allegiance. Pro-French and pro-Austrian ministers fought not just with words, but with spies, with threats, with bribes that flowed beneath the table like poison through a wound. Assassins were rumored, carriages overturned, letters burned. The palace, once merely hollow, now became dangerous. And Charles, sick, suffering, still expected to rule, felt it. He began to speak of demons again, of voices. He feared the people around him, accused servants of cursing his food, refused to eat unless a priest tasted it first. He began having episodes, days of silence, staring at the same spot on the wall for hours. Days of screaming, of pulling at his own hair, of accusing ministers of treason, of sorcery, of murder. The court learned to manage these moments. They scheduled audiences only in the early morning when his mind was clearest. They created documents with large, simple letters. They read everything aloud, slowly, like to a child. But nothing could stop what was coming. Spain was dying. And its king, its puppet, its symbol, its tragedy, was decaying alongside it. A man made of legacy and suffering, dragging a crumbling empire behind him like a corpse too heavy to bury. The world waited for the end, and so did he. He died in a room thick with incense and sweat, where priests shuffled like shadows and whispered prayers into the folds of brocade curtains that had not been opened in months. Outside, Madrid stirred beneath a grey and miserable sky. The air hung low. Autumn clung to the city like a shroud. Inside the royal Alcazar, the King of Spain, what was left of him, lay curled beneath layers of linen and lace, his skin waxen, his lips blue, his breath thin and wet. It had taken years to reach this point, years of silence, of degradation, of a body collapsing one system at a time. In his final months, Charles II could barely swallow. His bones ached so deeply he could no longer sit upright. He vomited after nearly every spoonful of broth. His hair had gone completely white. His face had sunk inward, all cheeks and sockets and hanging skin. He was only 38, but he looked ancient, a relic of a world even he had never truly understood. The palace doctors tried everything. They purged him. They bled him. They fed him crushed emeralds mixed with syrup, hoping to stir whatever divine fire they still believed might live inside him. But it only made him worse. His stomach bloated. His eyes yellowed. He soiled his sheets more often than not. And yet, he lived. Day after day, he clung to life, not out of will perhaps, but out of inertia, as if his body didn't know how to die, only how to decay. In those final days, the question of succession no longer haunted the court, it consumed it. The king had no children, no brothers, no nephews. The Habsburg line, which had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries, was at its end. and every European monarch knew that whoever sat on the Spanish throne next would inherit not just a crown, but an empire. Spain's holdings stretched across the globe, from the southern tip of Italy to the silver hills of Peru, from the Netherlands to the Caribbean. It was a carcass worth fighting over, and the vultures were already circling. Charles, in the fog of his final decline, was asked, gently, repeatedly, and finally, desperately, to name his heir. There were two real contenders: the Austrian Habsburgs, his bloodkin, who promised continuity and a shield against Bourbon expansion, and the Bourbons of France, specifically Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who claimed kinship through Charles's mother and offered a new beginning. Mariana, always the calculating mother, leaned toward Austria, but the French party at court was stronger, louder, and more ruthless. And in the final hours, in a moment of lucidity or manipulation, Charles signed the will. He named Philip of Anjou as his successor. The ink had barely dried before war drums began to sound across Europe. But first, they opened his body. The autopsy was conducted in whispers. The physicians, once so eager to study their royal subject, recoiled at what they found. His organs were shriveled, his stomach filled with undigested bile. His heart was soft, deflated. His intestines were rotten. His head was enormous for his frail shoulders, misshapen like a skull half-formed. And where there should have been evidence of manhood, of virility, of lineage, there was only a single shriveled testicle. It was not a king they found on that table. It was a monument to centuries of arrogance. The report was not made public at first. It was too gruesome, too humiliating. But it did not matter. The truth was already written on every starving face in Spain, every failed harvest, every shattered battalion limping home from war. Charles was dead, and the world would not rest. In Paris, Louis XIV declared, "There are no more Pyrenees," a chilling boast that signaled France's intent to dominate the Spanish crown. In Vienna, the Habsburgs called the Bourbon claim an abomination. England, wary of French power, prepared its fleets. The Dutch mobilized. Savoy, Prussia, Portugal, all chose sides. Lines were drawn not on maps, but on blood. The War of the Spanish Succession began almost immediately. It would last over a decade. It would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. It would see cities burned, kings betrayed, children orphaned, nations bankrupted. And it began in a silent bedroom where a drooling, broken man signed a name he could barely pronounce. The death of Charles II was not just the death of a king, it was the death of the Spanish Habsburgs, a line that had stretched across centuries, that had ruled in splendor and cruelty, that had drowned itself in its own reflection, ended with a whisper, with a cough, with a body so mutilated by inherited collapse that even the priests shuddered to anoint it. The world he left behind had already changed. The age of divine right was cracking. Bloodlines no longer protected power, they imperiled it. And in the silence after his final breath, as the bells of Madrid tolled low and slow, echoing down empty streets and through the shattered halls of court, the empire braced itself, not for mourning, but for war. Because no matter how hollow the crown, there were always hands ready to seize it. The bells fell silent, the black banners were lowered. And though the priests continued to chant their litanies in the cold echo of the palace chapel, no prayer could disguise what had just ended. With Charles II's last, rasping breath, the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg, the dynasty that had ruled Spain through gold, steel, fire, and faith, collapsed into the grave alongside him. There were no sons to mourn him, no daughters to carry his name, no heirs of flesh, only ashes of ambition. The man who had worn the crown since childhood, who had been baptized in hope, and anointed with expectation, was now remembered not for his triumphs, but for his body, for his weakness, for his silence, for the way he sat atop a dying empire like a spectre of all that had gone wrong. Charles II was not merely the end of a lineage, he was its punishment. He did not choose his fate. He was born into a palace built by ghosts, carried by women too devout to see the truth and men too proud to speak it. He was raised in rooms that smelled of incense and decay, surrounded by courtiers who bowed to him and then laughed behind their fans. He lived in golden shadows, draped in velvet, crowned in silver, and never once was he free. And all of it, was because his family refused to let go of its own reflection. For generations, the Habsburgs married each other, folding their blood back into itself in the name of control. They believed purity equaled strength, that to mix blood was to dilute power, that God had ordained their line as holy, as chosen, as sacred. And so they drew their own circles, their own family trees that looped like nooses, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, until the names repeated like prayers and the bodies began to break. Charles was the final result, the inevitable outcome of centuries of incest made divine. A man who could not walk properly until he was nearly 8, who could not speak clearly until he was 4, who could not rule, could not father, could not understand the empire collapsing beneath his feet. His life was a slow-motion collapse of the body, of the mind, of the illusion of royal immortality. And when it ended, the illusion ended with it. Historians now speak his name with a kind of reverence, not for what he did, but for what he revealed. In Charles II, the grandeur of dynastic Europe met the limits of biology. No throne can protect a child from the cruelty of inherited error. No amount of silk or sanctity can compensate for the twisting of chromosomes. His body became the canvas upon which history painted its warning, that blood, when caged, becomes poison. In the years that followed, the Habsburg name lived on, in Austria, in memory, in museums and manuscripts, but never again would it sit on the throne of Spain. The Bourbons took the crown, and though they too were not free from blood's entanglements, the lesson had been carved deep into the bones of the nation. The empire Charles left behind was no longer the Spain of his ancestors. The global power that had ruled the oceans and dictated terms to popes and emperors was gone. What remained was a wounded animal, territories still vast but brittle, governance still gilded but empty. Spain would continue, but it would never again rise to the heights it had once known. Its golden age, born in conquest and consecrated in blood, had ended with a childless man who cried in his sleep and could not understand why the world was slipping from his grasp. Today, Charles II is remembered less as a king and more as a case study. In textbooks and genetic seminars, his name is invoked as the archetype of dynastic failure. His autopsy, no blood, only black fluid, reads like a eulogy for a house that refused to listen. His portrait, once altered to show vitality and command, now seems tragic in its stillness. A young man dressed for war but unable to hold a sword. And yet, beneath all the shame and science and tragedy, there was still a boy. A boy born into a nightmare. A boy who never asked to rule, who never understood what it meant, who was used by everyone around him as a symbol, a shield, a justification. A boy who was crowned before he could walk, who was married off before he could speak, who died before he ever truly lived. He deserved more. He deserved peace. But peace was not something the Habsburgs knew how to give. In the end, his death did not merely mark the fall of a dynasty. It exposed the lie that had sustained it. That power can defy nature. That blood can be contained. That kings are gods. Charles II was not a god. He was human, painfully, tragically human. And in his body, the empire wrote its own epitaph, not in Latin, not in marble, but in the slow, visible collapse of a boy broken by the very legacy he was meant to preserve.